A small town in Tennessee becomes the battleground for justice when an old woman, with a past of quiet strength, finds herself the unexpected guardian of a baby girl after a tragic accident. A corrupt man, who has long held power through fear, seeks to reclaim the child, not for love but for control. A sheriff, caught between duty and loyalty, fights to protect the woman and the child, knowing that the law is not always enough. At the heart of it all is a dog, scarred but unbroken, who has already saved the child once and will not hesitate to do it again. As tensions rise and the town is forced to choose a side, the woman must decide. Can she hold on to the life she's built, or will she be forced to give up the child she's grown to love? And when the final confrontation comes, who will stand and who will fall? Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from, and if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. The storm arrived like a living beast, howling through the trees, clawing at rooftops and drowning the roads under sheets of relentless rain. It was the kind of storm that turned familiar landscapes into treacherous, shifting nightmares, where headlights barely cut through the darkness and the wipers on a windshield fought a losing battle against the fury of the sky. On the back roads of a small Tennessee town, Ethan Carter gripped the wheel of his SUV, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched tight. Beside him, Sarah clutched their 6-month-old daughter Lily in her arms, whispering a quiet lullaby in the hopes that the storm wouldn't frighten her. "We should pull over," Sarah urged, her voice barely audible over the relentless downpour. "It's too dangerous." Ethan's eyes flicked to her for the briefest second before returning to the waterlogged road ahead. "There's nowhere to pull over, Sarah. We just need to get home." Home. The word should have brought comfort. But in that moment, home felt as distant as the clear skies they had left behind hours ago. Then, it happened. A pair of headlights flared in the rearview mirror, too close, moving too fast. Ethan barely had time to react before the massive truck barreled into them from behind, sending the SUV skidding across the slick pavement. The world spun in a dizzying blur of rain, shattered glass, and the deafening sound of metal twisting around them. Sarah's scream was cut short as the car flipped once, twice, before landing with a brutal crunch in a roadside ditch. Then, silence. The rain continued to pour, tapping against the broken windshield in rhythmic cruelty. The truck that had struck them never stopped. It roared off into the night, swallowed by the storm, leaving behind the wreckage of the Carter family without a second thought. Inside the mangled SUV, everything was still. For what felt like an eternity, nothing moved. Then, from the back seat, the smallest, weakest sound broke the silence. A cry, faint, fragile, but alive. Lily. The baby's whimpering filled the crushed remains of the vehicle, cutting through the rain and the shattered stillness, like a lifeline to the living. But no other voices answered. Ethan and Sarah remained motionless, their bodies limp against their seats. Rusty had been roaming these back roads for as long as he could remember, a stray, forgotten by the world, surviving on scraps and instinct. The Labrador mix was old enough to know that storms like these were best waited out under the shelter of a broken barn or beneath the rusted frame of an abandoned truck. But something in the air made him hesitate tonight. A scent, oil, blood, fear. It was different from the usual roadkill smells that the storms uncovered. This was fresh, recent. His paws splashed through the rising water, pooling in the ditch, his nose guiding him toward the scent. The wreckage of the SUV loomed ahead, dark and twisted against the flashes of lightning. Rusty's ears flattened against his head as he approached, cautious but curious. He had learned long ago that humans didn't often welcome his kind. Not a stray, not a dog with ribs visible beneath his muddy coat. But this wasn't about him. Another sound reached him, a cry, small, weak, but desperate. The dog sniffed around the wreck, his muzzle pressing against broken glass, damp upholstery, metal still warm from the force of the crash. Then he found her, a tiny bundle, barely moving, strapped into a seat that had somehow remained upright in the chaos. Her scent was different, softer, cleaner than the humans he usually encountered. The baby's wide eyes locked onto Rusty's, her tiny fists clenching and unclenching as if she could sense the world around her was no longer the safe place she had always known. Rusty hesitated. His body screamed at him to run, to leave. This wasn't his fight. But then Lily whimpered again, her little chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, and something deep inside Rusty shifted. Carefully the dog nosed at the straps that held her in place. They were tight, too strong for his jaws to tear. His movements became more frantic, his heart hammering as the rain threatened to drown them both in the ditch. He pawed at the buckle, teeth scraping uselessly against it. Then a shift, the car groaned under its own weight, sinking further into the mud, the broken frame adjusting ever so slightly. And suddenly the strap loosened. Lily tumbled forward into the wet, broken interior. Rusty lunged, catching her gently in his mouth before she could slip deeper into the wreck. She was so light, so impossibly small, and as her tiny body trembled against his, Rusty knew there was no turning back. With careful steps, he dragged himself out of the ditch, Lily still held carefully in his mouth. The road stretched ahead, empty and dark, but Rusty didn't hesitate. He had only one mission now: find help and never let go. The rain lashed against Rusty's fur, soaking him to the bone as he trudged forward. Lily cradled delicately in his jaws. The cold bit into his flesh, but he barely noticed. The little bundle in his mouth was still breathing, still warm, and that was all that mattered. Every instinct told him to keep moving, to push through the storm, to ignore the hunger in his belly and the exhaustion creeping into his limbs. He had carried scraps of food in his mouth before, but never something so precious. Every few steps, he adjusted his hold, making sure the baby's tiny form remained secure. His jaws as gentle as a mother's touch. The ditch had been swallowing water fast, and Rusty had felt the mud sucking at his paws as he clawed his way back onto the road. The tires of the wrecked SUV were almost completely submerged now, the storm turning the shallow ditch into a rushing river. He didn't understand why the other humans in the car hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to the baby's cries, but he knew one thing: the small creature in his mouth could not stay there. The night was an endless stretch of black, broken only by the occasional flicker of lightning that illuminated the desolate road ahead. Rusty had traveled these streets before, scavenging for food behind diners and tailing the occasional kind-hearted stranger in hopes of a discarded meal. But tonight, there was no time to linger. He needed to find warmth, find safety, find help. He lifted his head, his nose twitching as he tried to catch the scent of something familiar. The rain muddied everything, washing away the smells he relied on to navigate. But then, through the chaos, he caught something, a distant wisp of wood smoke. Rusty pushed forward, paws splashing through puddles, claws scraping against slick pavement. His ribs ached, his muscles screamed, but he did not stop. The baby in his mouth whimpered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. He quickened his pace, his breath coming in heavy puffs. The scent of the fire grew stronger, and with it, something else. Human voices, faint but distinct. His ears perked up, his body tensing as he adjusted course, moving toward the light. Margaret Calloway had lived alone for nearly 20 years. Her old house, a relic from another era, stood at the edge of town, where the trees thickened and the roads turned into winding dirt paths. She had outlived her husband, outlived most of her friends, and found comfort in the steady rhythm of routine. Every night she built a fire in the hearth, sat in her rocking chair, and listened to the rain tapping against the windows. It had been a quiet life, a simple life, until tonight. The scratching at her door was so faint at first that she thought she had imagined it. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the shutters, making the old house groan as if it were alive. But then it came again, more insistent this time. A soft whimper followed, barely audible over the storm. Margaret frowned, setting down her knitting and rising stiffly from her chair. She moved toward the door, peering through the peephole, but the night beyond was a blur of rain and shadows. She hesitated only a moment before unfastening the lock and pulling the door open. The wind nearly ripped it from her hands, and she gasped as a flash of lightning revealed the figure standing on her porch. A dog, soaked to the skin, trembling from the cold, its fur matted with mud and debris, and clutched carefully in its mouth, wrapped in nothing but a damp onesie, was a baby. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. For a moment she could do nothing but stare. The dog's eyes met hers, and there was something in them that sent a shiver down her spine. Not fear, not desperation, but purpose, as if it knew exactly what it had done, exactly why it had come here. "Oh, Lord," Margaret whispered, reaching out with trembling hands. The dog didn't flinch as she carefully lifted the baby from its jaws, cradling the tiny body against her chest. The child whimpered, her little hands clenching into fists, and Margaret felt something inside her crack open. "Where on earth did you come from?" The dog let out a low, exhausted huff and collapsed onto the porch, its sides heaving with the effort of the journey. Margaret took a step back, glancing around as if expecting someone to appear from the darkness to claim the child. But the storm swallowed everything beyond the dim glow of her porch light. Whoever this baby belonged to, they were nowhere to be seen. Margaret wasted no time. She hurried inside, shutting the door against the storm, and carried the baby straight to the fireplace, where the warmth of the flames immediately wrapped around them. The child's skin was cold to the touch, and Margaret's hands shook as she grabbed a thick quilt from the couch, wrapping it around the tiny form. The baby stirred, her lips parting in a soft, hiccuping sob. "There now," Margaret murmured, brushing damp strands of hair from the baby's forehead. "You're safe, little one, you're safe." She turned back to the dog, who had dragged itself just past the threshold, its body curling up on the worn rug by the fire. Its eyes drooped, its breaths deep and steady, and Margaret realized with a pang of sadness just how thin the poor creature was. Every rib showed beneath its muddy fur, its paws raw from the road. It had given everything to bring this baby here. Margaret reached out, hesitating only a moment before resting a hand gently on the dog's head. "You did good, boy. You did real good." She had no idea where the child had come from, no idea what tragedy had led to this moment. But one thing was certain: this was no ordinary dog, and this was no ordinary night. The morning light crept through the storm's aftermath, weak and hesitant, casting long shadows over the soaked roads and downed power lines. The rain had finally subsided, leaving behind a town struggling to shake off the weight of the night's destruction. Trees lay cracked in half along the edges of the main street, their splintered limbs blocking driveways and sidewalks. The old wooden sign outside Pete's General Store had been ripped from its post, now resting half-buried in a ditch. Power flickered on and off across town, radio signals cutting in and out as the local station tried to provide updates. At the sheriff's office, Tom Reynolds sat at his desk, sipping coffee that had long since gone cold. His radio had been alive with calls since before dawn. Fallen trees, washed-out roads, a gas station that had partially flooded. But something about this storm felt different, something more than just the damage it had left behind. A call crackled through the static. "Sheriff, you there? We got something you might want to see." Tom grabbed the receiver, recognizing the voice of Deputy Carl McGregor, who had been sent out on patrol to survey the wreckage along Highway 12. "Go ahead, Carl. I found a car off the road, bad wreck." "Bad. Looks like it went into a ditch sometime last night. Must have been during the worst of it." Tom sat up straighter. "Any survivors?" "That's the thing, boss. No one inside. No bodies, nothing. But—" A pause. "Blood. Not a lot, but enough to be worrying. Looks like whoever was in there might have crawled out." Tom's fingers tightened around the radio. He'd seen plenty of crashes in his time, but something about this didn't sit right. Where exactly? Couple miles past the turnoff near Ridge Hollow. I'm on my way. Tom shoved his hat on, grabbed his coat, and stepped outside. The air still thick with the scent of wet earth and ozone. The streets were quiet, the town still waking up from the night's chaos. He climbed into his cruiser, flicked on the sirens just long enough to clear the early morning stragglers from his path, and sped toward the scene. When he arrived, Carl was standing near the edge of the ditch, hands on his hips, staring down at the wreckage. The SUV was barely recognizable. Its roof caved in, windshield shattered, the passenger side nearly torn off from the impact. Looks like they rolled a couple times before landing here, Carl muttered as Tom approached. Tom stepped closer, peering into the vehicle. The inside was a mess of broken glass, twisted metal and, his gut clenched, an empty baby seat, the straps still buckled. Jesus, Carl let out a low whistle. That ain't even the weird part. He pointed a few feet away, where the mud was disturbed, forming a trail leading away from the vehicle. Tom followed it with his eyes, noting the small footprints barely visible in the wet earth. Someone walked away from this, he murmured. But where the hell did they go? Carl exhaled through his nose. Tracks are hard to follow with all this water, but they lead toward town. Thing is, whoever left them, they weren't alone. Tom frowned. What do you mean? Carl crouched down, pointing to another set of prints. Paw prints, large, deep, like they belonged to a dog heavier than most strays. Tom exchanged a look with his deputy. You thinking what I'm thinking? Carl nodded grimly. Somebody got out of this wreck and they weren't walking alone. Question is, did that dog lead them somewhere or was it leading them away? Margaret Calloway stood at her kitchen counter, pouring a second cup of coffee, her hands still trembling from the events of the night before. She kept glancing toward the living room, where the baby lay curled up on her couch, wrapped in the thickest blanket Margaret could find. Lily. She had found the name stitched into the tiny fabric tag on the inside of the onesie. The dog, Rusty, lay near the fireplace, his body curled up tight, his chest rising and falling in slow, heavy breaths. He hadn't moved much since they had come inside, only lifting his head once when Margaret had checked on the baby in the middle of the night. It was clear he had exhausted himself, and Margaret had the feeling this wasn't the first time he had gone to bed hungry. She had already called the sheriff's office, left a message with the dispatcher about finding the baby on her porch, but no one had called back yet. The phone lines had been spotty since the storm, and she wasn't sure if her message had even gone through. She turned back toward the couch, watching as the baby's tiny fingers twitched in sleep. You're lucky, you know, she whispered. Lucky that dog found you. As if hearing her, Rusty's ears flicked slightly, though his eyes remained closed. A knock at the door made Margaret jump. She set her cup down, wiped her hands on her apron and hurried over, peeking through the curtain before unlocking the deadbolt. Sheriff Tom Reynolds stood on her porch, hat in hand, his eyes already scanning the interior. Margaret, he greeted, his voice careful. Got your message. We need to talk. She stepped aside, letting him in. Tom barely took 2 steps before his eyes landed on the couch, on the bundle of blankets holding the impossibly small child. His jaw tightened. We found a wreck this morning, he said, voice thick. A bad one. No sign of the driver or passengers, but there was a car seat. He swallowed. He, forcing himself to keep his gaze steady. Margaret, where exactly did you find her? Margaret crossed her arms over her chest. Didn't find her. That dog did. She nodded toward Rusty, who had finally lifted his head, eyes flicking between her and the sheriff. Tom exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. He'd seen plenty of strange things in his years as sheriff, but this was something else. Margaret's voice softened. She was freezing, Tom. If that dog hadn't brought her here... She shook her head, unwilling to finish the thought. Tom crouched beside the couch, studying Lily's tiny face. He had 3 kids of his own, all grown now, but something about this little girl, abandoned in the middle of a storm, stirred something deep in his chest. I'll put out an alert, he said after a long moment. Find out who she belongs to. Margaret hesitated. And if no one comes forward? Tom didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced at Rusty, at the way the dog's body tensed as if already bracing for something to be taken from him. He sighed. Then I guess we'll have another decision to make. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The sheriff had left nearly an hour ago, but the weight of his presence still lingered in the house. He had promised to do everything he could to find out where Lily came from, who she belonged to, but the way he had looked at the baby, the way his expression had softened when he crouched beside her. Margaret had a feeling he already knew that there was a good chance no one was coming. She glanced at the sleeping infant on the couch, at the dog still curled up on the rug, and sighed. Well, we'll just have to see how this plays out, won't we? Rusty opened one eye, his ears twitching slightly at the sound of her voice. But he didn't move. The poor thing had barely stirred since he collapsed by the fire, his exhaustion pulling him into a deep, motionless sleep. Margaret reached for the phone again, her fingers hovering over the receiver. She knew Tom would do what he could, but she also knew the limitations of a small-town sheriff's office. Things took time, and time was something she wasn't sure this baby had. Before she could convince herself otherwise, she lifted the receiver and dialed the number for the local hospital. The line clicked twice before a tired-sounding nurse answered. "Hello, this is St. Mary's Hospital. How can I help you?" Margaret cleared her throat. "Yes, this is Margaret Calloway. I have a baby here. Found on my porch last night during the storm. I think she might have been in a car accident. She needs to be checked out." There was a pause, then the sound of rustling papers. "A baby, Mum? How old?" Margaret looked toward the couch again. "Not more than 6 months. Was she injured?" "She seems all right. But she was freezing when I brought her in. I'd rather someone take a proper look." The nurse's voice softened. "Of course. Bring her in as soon as you can. We'll have a doctor waiting." Margaret exhaled slowly. "Thank you." She hung up the phone and stood, pressing a hand to the small of her back as she stretched. Her body ached from a lifetime of work, from the years spent alone in this house with nothing but the memories of the past keeping her company. But now things had changed. Now there was a baby in her living room. Now there was a dog who had brought that baby to her doorstep as if knowing exactly what he was doing. And now she had to get them both to the hospital. Margaret grabbed her coat from the hook by the door and slipped it on before carefully lifting Lily from the couch. The baby stirred but didn't wake, her tiny hands curling into the fabric of Margaret's sweater. "All right, sweetheart," she murmured, adjusting her grip. "Let's get you checked out." She turned to Rusty, who had lifted his head and was watching her with those sharp, intelligent eyes. "And you," she added, "you're coming too." Tom Reynolds had seen a lot in his years as sheriff of this town. Bar fights that had gone too far, family feuds that never seemed to end, kids who thought they could outrun the law in beat-up trucks that barely held together. But nothing had ever unsettled him quite like this. The wrecked SUV was already being towed from the ditch when he arrived back on the scene, but he wasn't looking at the vehicle. He was looking at the ground, at the trail of footprints leading away from the wreckage, the tiny imprints of bare baby feet, the paw prints that ran alongside them. Carl stood a few feet away, hands on his hips. "I don't know what to make of this, boss." Tom exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Neither do I." The tow truck driver climbed down from the cab, wiping his hands on an already grease-stained rag. "No sign of the parents?" "No," Tom replied. "But the baby's alive. Found her this morning." The driver blinked. "Alive? After a wreck like this?" Tom nodded. "Seems like a stray dog pulled her out." There was a long silence before the driver let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." Tom turned back to the vehicle, taking in the damage once more. The crushed roof, the shattered windows, the way the front end had caved in from the impact. Whoever had been driving hadn't just gone off the road, they had been hit. Hard. Carl stepped forward, his voice low. "So what do you think happened here?" Tom didn't answer right away. He crouched down, running his fingers over a long scrape in the metal. Paint transfer. The truck that had hit them hadn't just clipped them, it had sideswiped them. "Somebody ran them off the road," he murmured. Carl frowned. "You think it was on purpose?" Tom stood, his jaw tightening. "I don't believe in coincidences." Carl let out a slow breath, glancing toward the footprints again. "And the parents?" Tom shook his head. No sign of them. No blood on the seats. No drag marks. He turned toward the dense tree line bordering the road. They could be out there somewhere. Carl followed his gaze. If they are, they're in bad shape. Tom's stomach churned at the thought. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know that in situations like this, the longer someone was missing, the less likely they were to be found alive. And if this had been intentional, if someone had forced that car off the road, then the chances of survival were even lower. He turned back to Carl. "We need to get search teams out here, now!" Carl nodded and reached for his radio, already calling it in. Tom stared at the wreckage a moment longer before exhaling sharply and heading for his cruiser. He had a bad feeling about this. A real bad feeling. And he wasn't sure he was ready to find out if he was right. Margaret pulled into the hospital parking lot, shifting the truck into park before turning to look at Rusty. He had been silent the entire ride, sitting in the passenger seat with his ears perked, eyes flicking between her and the baby as if making sure they were still there. "Well," she said, opening her door, "let's get this over with." She stepped out, carefully lifting Lily from her car seat before slamming the door shut with her hip. Rusty jumped down a second later, shaking out his fur before trotting to her side. Together, they walked into the hospital, the automatic doors sliding open with a soft whoosh. The nurse at the front desk looked up, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of the dog, but she didn't say anything. Margaret stepped forward. "I called earlier about the baby." The nurse nodded quickly. "Yes, of course. Right this way." She led them down a short hallway and into a private exam room. A doctor was already waiting, his expression kind but serious. Margaret laid Lily down on the exam table, watching as the doctor began his assessment. Rusty sat beside her, his tail thumping against the floor. The doctor glanced at her. "And you said a dog found her?" Margaret nodded. "This one." The doctor raised an eyebrow before looking at Rusty, then back at the baby. "Well," he murmured, listening to Lily's heartbeat through his stethoscope, "I'd say he saved her life." Margaret glanced at the dog, at the way he was watching Lily with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "I'd say you're right." Tom Reynolds drove down the winding back roads, his eyes flicking between the tree line and the grey sky above. The storm had passed, but its presence lingered in the soaked earth, the scattered debris, the thick scent of damp pine and mud. His gut twisted the way it always did when something was wrong, when something didn't sit right, and this didn't sit right at all. The baby had been found. That was a miracle in itself, but where were her parents? A wreck like that should have meant bodies, injured or otherwise. Instead, there had been nothing. No blood in the front seats, no sign that anyone had even tried to crawl free from the wreck, just an empty car, a missing family, and a baby found miles away, delivered by a dog like some divine intervention. Tom exhaled sharply and gripped the wheel tighter. It wasn't adding up. "Sheriff," Carl's voice crackled through the radio. "Got a couple of search teams combing the woods near the wreck. No sign of anything yet, but we'll keep at it." "Good. Make sure they spread out. If they left the wreck on foot, they could have gone any direction," Tom replied, eyes scanning the roadside. A pause. Then Carl's voice returned, slower this time. "Think they walked out on their own, boss?" Tom didn't answer right away. He had been asking himself the same question since the moment he saw that baby seat. Empty and waiting. A baby doesn't unbuckle itself. "I don't know, Carl, but I don't like it." He turned onto a dirt access road leading toward the deeper part of the woods. The rain had turned it into a mess of slick mud and standing water, and he drove carefully, his tires groaning against the softened ground. Then up ahead, something caught his eye. A set of deep tire tracks veering off into the trees. He slowed the cruiser to a stop, radioed Carl his location, and stepped out. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, the only sound the distant chirp of birds just beginning to return after the storm. He moved toward the tracks, his boots sinking slightly into the mud, his hand instinctively resting near his holster. It didn't take long to find it. Just past the tree line, barely visible through the dense foliage, a second vehicle sat abandoned. It was a truck, older, rusted in spots, but still in decent shape. The driver's side door was open, hanging slightly off its hinge, as if someone had left in a hurry. Tom's stomach turned. He approached carefully, eyes sweeping the area. No sign of movement, no footprints leading away, just more mud, disturbed but unreadable in the mess the storm had left behind. Then he saw the blood. It wasn't much, just a smear along the edge of the door, but it was enough to tell him what he already suspected. Something bad had happened here. His pulse ticked up as he peered inside the cab. The interior was a mess. Empty fast food wrappers, a torn flannel draped over the passenger seat, an old duffel bag half-zipped with clothes spilling out. But it was what was on the floor that made his throat go dry. A wallet, open and soaked. He reached in carefully, flipping through the damp contents until he found what he was looking for. The driver's license read, Ethan Carter. Tom exhaled sharply, his grip tightening around the plastic. Ethan Carter. The name meant nothing to him, but now he had something solid, something to work with. He looked over the rest of the wallet. Credit cards, a few crumpled bills, nothing that explained what had happened here. Then he saw the photograph. Tucked behind the plastic sleeve of the license was a small, worn picture of a family. Ethan, a woman with long dark hair and a baby nestled between them. Lily. Tom's chest ached as he stared at the faces, at the way Ethan's arm curled protectively around his wife and child. Where the hell were they now? He stepped back from the truck, his mind racing. If Ethan's wallet was here, then Ethan had been here, but there was no sign of him, no sign of his wife, no sign of a struggle. And that was the part that bothered him the most. A crash like the one on Highway 12? You expect people to be injured, disoriented, crawling out, looking for help. But instead, he had an abandoned truck with blood on the door and no clear sign of what had happened next. Tom keyed his radio. Carl, you copy? Go ahead, boss. I need you to run a name for me. Ethan Carter. Might have a local address, maybe a work history. See what you can dig up. Carl hesitated, then responded, That the guy from the wreck? Tom looked down at the wallet in his hand. Yeah, I just found his truck. Silence. Then Carl exhaled slowly. I'll get right on it. Tom lowered the radio and took one last look at the truck, his gut telling him that whatever had happened out here, it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. Margaret sat in the hospital waiting room, her hands resting in her lap, trying to push away the gnawing sense of worry curling in her gut. The doctor had taken Lily back nearly an hour ago, and though he had assured her it was just a routine checkup, she still felt uneasy. Rusty lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes never left the door. He was waiting too. Margaret reached down, running her fingers over the rough fur of his back. You know something, don't you? She murmured. Rusty's ears twitched, but he didn't move. The door finally opened, and the doctor stepped out, holding a clipboard against his chest. His face was unreadable, and Margaret's stomach clenched. She all right? The doctor nodded. She's fine, a little dehydrated, but nothing serious. We're keeping her warm, giving her fluids, no signs of injuries. Margaret exhaled, relief washing over her. Thank the Lord. The doctor hesitated. There's something else, though. Margaret stiffened. What? We ran a quick blood test, standard for foundlings. We were hoping it might help us identify her parents. He cleared his throat. It's not public knowledge yet, but there was an Amber Alert issued this morning, a missing child. Margaret's breath caught. The alert matches Lily's description. Right age, right features. And the names listed on the report? The doctor's expression darkened. Ethan and Sarah Carter. Margaret's fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt. Then why hasn't anyone come looking for her? The doctor's hesitation stretched a second too long. That's what we don't know. Margaret felt her throat tighten. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Rusty lifted his head, his body going rigid, as if he could sense the shift in the atmosphere. Margaret swallowed hard. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. The sun hung low over the town, its weak morning rays cutting through the fog still clinging to the trees. The hospital's parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few cars parked near the emergency entrance. Margaret sat on a bench just outside, her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts tangled in knots she couldn't undo. The weight of the doctor's words lingered in her mind, circling like a hawk over wounded prey. Ethan and Sarah Carter, missing, their child found in the arms of a stray dog. Margaret wasn't the kind of woman to believe in fate, but this felt like something she wasn't meant to ignore. Rusty sat beside her, his body tense, his ears flicking at every small noise. He hadn't relaxed since they left the hospital. Every muscle in his lean frame was coiled, as if he were waiting for something. Margaret reached down, brushing her fingers against his head. "You brought her here for a reason, didn't you?" Rusty didn't move, didn't acknowledge her voice, just kept his golden eyes fixed on the horizon. The sound of an approaching car pulled Margaret from her thoughts. A sheriff's cruiser rolled up, coming to a slow stop in front of her. Tom stepped out, his face drawn, his expression unreadable as he shut the door behind him. "I need to talk to you," he said. Margaret nodded, standing. She wasn't sure she wanted to hear what he had to say, but she had already been drawn too deep into this to turn away now. Tom exhaled, adjusting his hat. "We found Ethan Carter's truck. About 2 miles from the crash site. It had been abandoned." Margaret's stomach tightened. No sign of him or his wife. No, but there was blood on the door. Tom's voice was grim. "Not enough to mean something fatal, but enough to know someone was hurt." Margaret swallowed hard, glancing at Rusty. The dog's ears twitched again, and she could see it now. He wasn't just waiting, he was listening. Tom followed her gaze. "That dog of yours," he murmured, kneeling in front of Rusty. "He's been through something, hasn't he?" Margaret hesitated. "He's not mine. He just showed up." Tom ran a hand along Rusty's side, his fingers brushing over old scars hidden beneath his thick coat. He frowned, pressing lightly against one, and Rusty let out a low, warning growl. "That's not just from being a stray," Tom muttered. "These are old injuries. Someone did this to him." Margaret's jaw tightened. She hadn't thought much about where Rusty had come from. He had simply appeared when he was needed, like a ghost from the past. But now, staring at the way his body tensed under Tom's touch, she realized there was more to him than just being a stray. Tom stood. "You ever seen him before?" Margaret shook her head. "No, not before last night." Tom's lips pressed into a thin line. "I think we need to find out who he belonged to." Margaret's heart clenched. "Why? What does that have to do with the Carters?" Tom didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone, flipping through photos before turning the screen toward her. It was a picture of Rusty, thinner, younger, but still unmistakably him. He was chained to a post, his fur matted with dirt, his eyes dull. The image made Margaret's stomach churn. "We picked up a guy a couple of years back for animal cruelty," Tom said, his voice quieter now. "Had a whole kennel of dogs. Most of them were pit for fighting, some were just for entertainment." He glanced at Rusty again. This one was one of the few that survived. Margaret stared at the photo, her fingers curling into her sweater. "How did he get away?" Tom sighed. "No one knows. The guy got locked up, but not all the dogs were accounted for. Some were sold off before we got there. Some just disappeared." Margaret looked down at Rusty, at the scars hidden beneath his thick coat, at the intelligence in his eyes. He had survived things no dog should have to survive, and yet, somehow, through all of it, he had found his way to Lily. She reached out, running her hand gently over his back. "And now he's here," she murmured. Tom nodded. "Yeah, and I don't think it's a coincidence." Margaret's pulse quickened. "You think someone's looking for him?" Tom hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. But what I do know is that a dog like this doesn't just happen upon a baby in the middle of a storm. He was running from something." Margaret's throat tightened. "Or someone," Tom exhaled, rubbing his temples. Look, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but the timing of all this, it's too damn convenient. A missing family, a wrecked car, an abandoned truck, and a dog that shouldn't even be here. He shook his head. It's not adding up. Margaret swallowed hard. She didn't want to believe it, didn't want to think about what it could mean. But deep down, she knew Tom was right. Something wasn't right, and they were running out of time to figure out what it was. Rusty stood suddenly, his body going rigid, his ears pricking forward. He let out a low, warning growl, his gaze locked on something beyond the hospital parking lot. Tom turned sharply, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. "What is it, boy?" Rusty took a step forward, his muscles tensed, his tail stiff. Margaret felt a chill crawl down her spine. Something was coming, and Rusty knew it. Tom's radio crackled to life, Carl's voice sharp and urgent. "Sheriff, you need to get back here. Now!" Tom grabbed the radio, his voice tight. "What is it?" Carl hesitated. Then, "We found something." Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs. Tom's jaw clenched. "Where?" Carl exhaled. "Near the truck, about 50 yards out." Tom turned, his eyes meeting Margaret's. "A body." Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her. Rusty let out another low growl, stepping closer to her. His body pressed against her legs, as if shielding her from something unseen. Tom exhaled, gripping his radio tighter. "We'll be there in 5. Margaret felt her throat tighten, but she forced herself to stand tall. Something had led Rusty to Lily. Something had drawn him away from whatever horror had happened on that road. And now, whatever that something was, it was waiting for them in the woods. Tom Reynolds drove faster than he should have, the cruiser kicking up mud as he sped toward the site where Carl had found the body. His fingers were tight around the wheel. Jaw clenched so hard it ached. The radio had gone quiet after Carl's last transmission, leaving too much space for the thoughts racing through his mind. A wrecked car, a missing family, a baby found in the jaws of a stray dog, and now a body lying out in the woods. It was all starting to feel like something much worse than an accident. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, her knuckles white as she clutched her sweater. She hadn't said a word since they left the hospital, but Tom didn't need her to. He could feel the tension rolling off her in waves. Rusty lay in the back seat, his body rigid, eyes locked on the window. He hadn't relaxed since they left, his ears twitching at every sound, his muscles tight like he was preparing for a fight. As they rounded the bend leading to the site, Carl's truck came into view, parked just off the dirt road. 2 other deputies stood near the edge of the tree line, their faces grim as they watched the approaching vehicle. Tom barely put the car in park before he was out, moving toward them with quick, deliberate steps. "Where?" he asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Carl pointed toward the woods. "About 50 yards in. It's bad, Tom." Tom exhaled sharply. He had known it would be. Margaret climbed out behind him, and before anyone could stop him, Rusty leapt from the back seat, landing in the mud with a splash before sprinting toward the trees. "Rusty!" Margaret called, but the dog didn't stop. Tom didn't waste time. He followed, dodging low-hanging branches as he pushed through the thick undergrowth. The smell hit him first, earthy, metallic, unmistakably blood. Then he saw it. The body was male, lying face down in the mud, his clothes soaked through, his hair matted with dirt and rain. Blood stained the ground beneath him, though not as much as Tom would have expected for a fatal wound. Rusty stood a few feet away, his hackles raised, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Tom moved closer, crouching beside the body, careful not to disturb anything. He reached out, turning the man's face just enough to see. Ethan Carter. Margaret gasped behind him, her hand flying to her mouth. Tom exhaled, his breath unsteady. He checked the man's pulse, knowing he wouldn't find one, but doing it anyway. The skin was cold. Too cold. Carl came up behind him. "Shit," he muttered. Tom sat back on his heels, wiping a hand down his face. "Where's Sarah?" Carl shook his head. No sign of her. Tom's jaw tightened. "Keep looking," Carl nodded, already turning to relay the order to the others. Tom turned back to the body, eyes scanning over the details. Ethan had bruises on his arms, like someone had grabbed him. His clothes were torn in places, his shoes covered in mud, as if he had been running. There was a cut on his temple, but that wasn't what had killed him. No gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, but he was dead all the same. Tom glanced at Rusty, who hadn't moved, his body tense as he stared at the lifeless man. "What do you know, boy?" Tom murmured. Rusty's ears twitched, but he didn't make a sound. Tom stood, his mind already working through the pieces. Ethan had survived the crash. He had gotten out. He had run. But from what? And why had he died here, alone in the woods, without his wife? Margaret knelt beside the body, her fingers trembling as she reached toward Ethan's chest. "Margaret," Tom started, but she wasn't listening. Her hand brushed against the fabric of Ethan's jacket, then froze. Tom frowned. "What is it?" She swallowed, then carefully reached into the inner pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper. It was damp, the ink smudged, but still legible. She opened it with shaking hands. Tom read over her shoulder. "If anything happens to us, protect Lily. Don't let them take her." The breath left his lungs. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Who's them?" Tom didn't answer. He didn't have to. Because in that moment, the one thing he had feared most settled deep in his gut. This wasn't just an accident. This was something worse. By the time they got back to town, the news had already started to spread. A body found in the woods, a missing woman, a baby left behind. It didn't take long for the rumors to start, some wild, some grounded in just enough truth to make them dangerous. Margaret had barely stepped onto her porch when the first car pulled up, kicking up dust as it skidded to a stop. Child Protective Services. Tom had expected it, but that didn't mean he welcomed it. A woman stepped out, her expression tight. "Sheriff Reynolds." Tom nodded once. "Miss Avery?" Her gaze flicked to Margaret, then to the bundle in her arms. "We need to talk." Margaret's grip on Lily tightened instinctively. "You're not taking her." Miss Avery sighed, her voice careful. "Mrs. Calloway, I understand how you feel, but we have protocols in place for situations like this." Tom stepped forward. "Lily's parents are missing. Her father is dead. That's not a reason to rip her from the only home she has right now." Miss Avery looked unimpressed. "It's a reason to make sure she's in the care of someone legally recognized as a guardian." Margaret's shoulders squared. "Then I'll be her guardian." Tom wasn't sure who was more surprised, him or Miss Avery. The social worker hesitated. "Mrs. Calloway, that's not how this works. There's a process, then we start the process." Margaret's voice was firm. "I don't care what it takes. That little girl has lost enough." Miss Avery studied her, then exhaled. "We'll be conducting a home evaluation, background checks. Until then, Lily will stay in state custody." Margaret's face hardened. "The hell she will." Tom sighed, stepping between them before things escalated. "Miss Avery, let's be reasonable. Margaret's the one who found Lily. She's taken care of her since the moment she was brought in. There's no safer place for her right now." Miss Avery hesitated, then glanced at Rusty, who stood rigid beside Margaret, as if he understood every word. After a long pause, she relented. "For now, Lily can stay here, but we'll be monitoring the situation closely." Margaret nodded once. "Fine." Miss Avery turned to leave, but stopped beside Tom. "Sheriff," she said quietly, "if there's more to this, if there's danger, you need to let me know." Tom's throat was tight. "I know." She left without another word. Margaret exhaled shakily, cradling Lily close. Rusty leaned against her leg, his presence grounding. Tom ran a hand through his hair. There was a storm coming, and they were standing right in the middle of it. The night was thick with silence, the kind that settled in after a storm, waiting for the next one. Margaret sat in her rocking chair, Lily curled in her arms, her tiny breaths warm against Margaret's chest. Rusty lay at her feet, his ears twitching, his body rigid even in rest. He hadn't relaxed since they'd come back from the hospital. Neither had Margaret. Tom's words still echoed in her mind. This wasn't just an accident. This was something worse. She had seen plenty of bad things in her life, some that happened suddenly, without warning. Others that had been creeping in the shadows all along, waiting for the right moment to strike. This felt like the latter. The knock at the door came slow and steady, like whoever was on the other side wasn't in a hurry. Rusty was up in an instant, his growl low and deep, a warning. Margaret's heart kicked up, but she forced herself to stay calm. Whoever it was, they weren't expecting a warm welcome. She rose carefully, shifting Lily to one arm as she reached for the shotgun she kept near the doorway. The safety was already off. She cracked the door just enough to see. Tom stood on the porch, his face shadowed under the dim porch light. "You look like hell," Margaret muttered, stepping aside. Tom huffed, stepping in. His eyes flicked to Lily, then to Rusty, who hadn't stopped growling. "I'd say the feeling's mutual." Margaret shut the door behind him. "What is it?" Tom ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "I need you to hear this before you hear it from someone else. We got an ID on who was driving that truck the night of the wreck." Margaret stiffened. "Who?" Tom hesitated, then said, "Kyle Jennings." The name hit her like a punch to the gut. Kyle Jennings. She knew that name. Everyone in town did. He was trouble from the moment he was old enough to cause it. A drunk who had been given too many second chances. The kind of man who never learned because the world never made him. And now he was tied to this. Margaret's grip on Lily tightened. "Tell me you've got him locked up." Tom's jaw clenched. "I wish I could." Margaret exhaled sharply, her pulse hammering. "What do you mean you wish you could? He killed that girl's father, Tom." "We don't have proof of that," Tom said, his voice tight. "All we know is his truck was involved. He's saying it was stolen." Margaret let out a bitter laugh. "Of course he is," Tom nodded. "I don't buy it either, but I can't charge him with anything without something solid." Margaret stared at him, anger simmering beneath her skin. "And you think he's just going to sit tight while you figure that out?" Tom sighed. "No, which is why I need you to be careful." Margaret's stomach turned cold. "You think he'll come here?" Tom met her gaze. "I think if he knows that baby's still alive, he's going to want to make sure she can't talk when she gets old enough." The words sent a chill down her spine. Lily whimpered in her sleep, shifting slightly in Margaret's arms. Tom rubbed a hand down his face. "I'm going to keep a patrol near the house, but I need you to promise me something." Margaret swallowed. "What?" "If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you call me." She nodded. "I will." Tom hesitated, his gaze lingering on Lily. Then he turned to leave. Rusty growled low as the door opened, his body tense. Tom paused. "That dog of yours, don't let him out of your sight." Then he was gone, and the house felt smaller in his absence. Margaret locked the door, checking it twice before heading back to the living room. Rusty was still on edge, his eyes fixed on the door. She sat down carefully, stroking the baby's back. "Guess we're not sleeping much tonight, huh?" Rusty let out a quiet huff, settling beside her, but never taking his eyes off the door. Kyle Jennings sat at the corner of a dimly lit bar, nursing a drink he hadn't paid for. His hands shook as he lifted the glass, his fingers still sore from the bruises he'd earned 2 nights ago. He'd told the sheriff what he needed to say. His truck had been stolen. He didn't know how it ended up in the woods. It was a lie. He had been there. He had seen Ethan Carter's face, twisted in panic as his truck swerved into the road, headlights flashing too fast for reaction time. He had seen the wreck happen in his rearview mirror, had heard the sound of metal screaming against asphalt, and he had kept driving. He hadn't known about the baby, not at first, but now the whole damn town was talking about it. Kyle downed the rest of his drink, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. He could feel the walls closing in. The sheriff was looking at him too hard. People were whispering, watching him with that knowing look that made his skin crawl. He had to finish this, had to make sure there were no loose ends. He tossed a few crumpled bills onto the bar and walked out into the cold night. Margaret was dozing when Rusty's growl snapped her awake. It was low and dangerous, the kind that sent ice down her spine. She sat up, instinctively tightening her hold on Lily. "Rusty!" The dog's ears were pricked, his body rigid as he stared at the door. Then she heard it. A footstep outside, slow, deliberate. Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs. She reached for the shotgun without thinking, her hands steady even as her pulse thundered. Rusty moved before she did. In a flash he was up, launching himself toward the door with a snarl that echoed through the small house. He hit it hard, his claws scraping against the wood. The footsteps stopped. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Then another step, closer this time. Rusty barked deep and sharp. His entire body was a coiled spring, ready to tear into whatever was on the other side of that door. Margaret swallowed, raising the shotgun. A voice slurred through the silence. "I know you're in there, Calloway." "Kyle." Margaret's fingers tightened around the stock of the gun. "You got something that belongs to me." Her stomach turned. "She doesn't belong to you." Kyle laughed, a slow, ugly sound. "Maybe not, but I can't have her running around, can I?" Margaret's blood went cold. Rusty snarled again, his body vibrating with fury. Kyle shifted on the porch. "Open the door." "Margaret!" She raised the shotgun, steadying it at the door. "I'm giving you one warning, Kyle. Step off my porch, or they'll be cleaning you off it in the morning." Silence. Then, footsteps retreating. Rusty stayed at the door, his growl still rumbling deep in his chest. Margaret didn't lower the gun until she heard a car start, the tires spinning against gravel. She let out a shaky breath. Rusty sat back down, his eyes still locked on the door. Margaret reached down, running a hand over his head. Good boy. He had saved Lily once, and tonight he had done it again. Morning came with the weight of a restless night. The sky was still heavy with storm clouds, though no rain had fallen since the night before. The sun barely pushed through the grey haze, casting long, muted shadows across Margaret's small front yard. She hadn't slept. Not really. She had sat in the rocking chair with the shotgun across her lap, Lily in her arms and Rusty lying by the door, every muscle in his body tense, as if he were waiting for Kyle to return. But he hadn't. Margaret had listened to the distant roar of his truck fading into the night, but she hadn't fooled herself into thinking that meant he was gone for good. Men like Kyle Jennings never backed down. They waited. They simmered. And when the time was right, they struck harder. Now, as she poured herself a cup of coffee, she kept one eye on the window, scanning the driveway, the road, the tree line beyond her property. She wasn't expecting Kyle to be bold enough to try again in broad daylight, but she wasn't going to pretend he wasn't watching. Rusty was watching too. He hadn't moved from the door. His ears flicked at every sound, his body coiled like a spring. She set her mug down and crouched beside him, running a hand over his back. His fur was warm beneath her palm, but she could still feel the scars hidden beneath the thick coat. She didn't want to think about what he had been through before he ended up here. But it was getting harder to ignore. "You're not just any dog, are you?" she murmured. Rusty didn't move, but his tail gave a small, slow wag. Margaret sighed, scratching behind his ear. "You sure picked one hell of a time to show up." The phone rang, breaking the silence. She grabbed it, her heart already in her throat. "Hello? It's Tom." His voice was steady, but she could hear the exhaustion beneath it. "You all right?" Margaret exhaled. "We're fine." She heard his breath on the other end, slow and deliberate. "He came, didn't he?" She swallowed. "Yeah." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Tom said, "I'll be there soon." Margaret hung up and set the phone down. She knew better than to argue. She turned back to Rusty. "Guess we should get ready for company." Tom arrived less than 15 minutes later. His cruiser rumbled up the driveway, kicking up a thin mist of dust. Margaret stepped onto the porch as he climbed out, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He didn't have to ask her what happened. He already knew. Rusty was at her side, his posture rigid, his eyes locked on Tom as he approached. Tom stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and studied the dog. "He didn't leave your side, did he?" Margaret shook her head. "Not for a second." Tom exhaled, his gaze flicking toward the door, toward the space where Kyle had stood just hours before. "He's not going to stop, Margaret." She knew that. She crossed her arms over her chest. "What do we do?" Tom hesitated, then said, "We make sure you're not alone when he does." Margaret frowned. "I'm not leaving." "I'm not asking you to," Tom said. "But we're going to make damn sure Kyle knows this isn't a fight he can win." Margaret felt something tighten in her chest. "And how do we do that?" Tom glanced at Rusty. "By showing him you're not the only one watching." The town had always been close-knit, the kind of place where news traveled faster than the morning paper. It didn't take long for word to spread about what had happened at Margaret's house the night before. By noon, people had started stopping by, offering words of support, extra locks, even a shotgun or two. Margaret appreciated the gestures, but it was Rusty who truly changed things. It started when Tom told his deputies about him, about how he had stood guard, how he had faced down Kyle without a moment's hesitation. Then it reached the people who had seen Rusty before, who had recognized his scars and his history. And suddenly Rusty wasn't just some stray dog. He was something more. By the afternoon, someone had dropped off a brand new collar and a food bowl. Someone else had left a thick blanket, neatly folded on the porch, with a note that simply read, "For the hero dog." Margaret didn't know how to respond. Rusty had been a shadow, a ghost of something broken and forgotten. And now he was being given something he had never had before, a place, a home. By the time the sun dipped low, the house no longer felt like it had the night before. It wasn't just a fragile shell waiting to be cracked. It wasn't just a target. It was a line in the sand. Margaret stood on the porch, Rusty sitting beside her, watching the last of the day's visitors drive away. She looked down at him, at the way his eyes followed the movement, always alert. "You're part of this now," she murmured. Rusty lifted his head, his tail giving a single, solid thump against the porch. Margaret reached down and scratched behind his ears. "Guess that makes you family." Kyle sat in his truck at the edge of town, fingers drumming against the steering wheel. He had never been the type to second-guess himself. He took what he wanted, did what he needed to do, and never looked back. But this wasn't going the way he had planned. He had thought it would be simple. Take out Ethan, get rid of the woman, and the rest would fall into place. But now the whole damn town was watching, and that dog— Kyle's grip tightened on the wheel. That damn dog had ruined everything. He had never been afraid of an animal before. He had fought dogs, starved them, beaten them until they learned who was in charge. He had never met one he couldn't break. But Rusty wasn't just any dog, and Kyle was starting to realize that. He exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders, forcing himself to calm down. This wasn't over. It had just begun. That night the house was quiet. Lily slept peacefully in her crib, her small hands curled into tiny fists. Margaret lay in bed, listening to the wind move through the trees, her thoughts a tangled mess. Rusty lay at the foot of her bed, his breathing slow and steady. She didn't know what was coming next. She didn't know if Kyle would come back tomorrow or next week, or if he was already planning something worse. But what she did know was that when he did, she wouldn't be facing him alone. Rusty had already saved Lily once, and Margaret had no doubt that if the time came, he would do it again. The morning came slow and grey, the sky swollen with the promise of more rain. Margaret sat on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in her hands, Rusty lying at her feet. The town had shifted overnight. She could feel it. People had taken sides whether they meant to or not. Some saw Lily as a child in need of protection. Others saw her as a problem, a loose thread in something bigger, something they weren't sure they wanted to be involved in. Margaret wasn't sure which was worse, the silence or the whispers. Tom had been by just before sunrise. He had stayed long enough to tell her that Kyle was still in town, that he hadn't run like some might have expected. Instead, he had been talking, stirring things up, planting seeds in the minds of people who liked to keep their hands clean, but didn't mind someone else doing their dirty work. It didn't take long for the trouble to start. By mid-morning, the first car pulled up. It was a sleek, unfamiliar thing, too polished for a town like this. Margaret didn't recognize it, but she recognized the man who stepped out, James Bennett. He was a lawyer from a few towns over, the kind that only showed up when there was money involved. He wore a crisp suit despite the damp air, his tie perfectly knotted, his shoes too clean for the muddy road he stood on. Margaret didn't move from her chair. She just watched as he adjusted his cuffs and finally looked up at her. "Mrs. Calloway," he greeted, his voice smooth, practiced. "Mind if I come up?" Margaret took a slow sip of her coffee. "I do mind, actually." James let out a small chuckle, as if he had expected that. He took a step closer anyway. "I'm here on behalf of a concerned party," he continued, ignoring her sharp gaze. "There's been some discussion about the little girl you have in your care." Margaret set her cup down on the armrest. Rusty lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching. "What kind of discussion?" James sighed as if he were delivering unfortunate news. "There are people in town who don't think she should be here, that it's not safe." Margaret's fingers curled around the arm of the chair. "Not safe for who?" James didn't flinch. "For anyone. There's been talk of involving the state. CPS has already opened a case." Margaret exhaled slowly through her nose. "I know that, and I also know that no judge is going to take her from me unless there's a damn good reason." James nodded. "That's why I'm here, to offer an alternative before it gets that far." She knew where this was going. She had seen men like him before, men who thought they could talk their way into anything. She glanced at Rusty, who was now fully awake, watching James with dark, unreadable eyes. "Go ahead," she said. "Let's hear it." James folded his hands in front of him. "There are families, good families, who would be willing to take her in. People who have the resources to make sure she's taken care of properly." Margaret barked out a laugh. "Properly? You mean quietly?" James didn't deny it. "All I'm saying is that there are options. Options that don't involve drawn-out court battles, government intervention, or unnecessary conflict." Margaret leaned forward, her voice dropping. "You work for Kyle?" James's smile tightened. "I work for people who want to avoid trouble." Margaret shook her head. "Then tell your people trouble's already here." She stood, Rusty rising beside her, his body tense. James held up a hand, a placating gesture, but he had already lost the battle. "Think about it," he said, stepping back toward his car. "No one wants this to get messy." Margaret watched as he slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and disappeared down the road. Rusty let out a low growl, his tail flicking. Margaret sighed. "I know, boy. I don't like him either." Tom was waiting when she got to town. The sheriff's office sat at the end of Main Street, a small brick building with a single deputy posted outside. Tom was inside, sitting at his desk, rubbing the bridge of his nose like he had the weight of the world pressing down on him. Margaret closed the door behind her. "I had a visitor this morning." Tom didn't look up. "James Bennett?" Margaret sat across from him. "You knew?" Tom finally met her gaze. "I got a call last night. Kyle's stirring things up, getting people to listen to him. He's claiming the baby should go to someone else, someone more responsible." Margaret's lips thinned. "And people are buying it," Tom exhaled. "Some, not everyone, but enough to make things complicated." Margaret stared at him, searching his face for any sign of hesitation. "Do you think they'll take her?" Tom leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "Not if I have anything to say about it. But Kyle's not the only one pulling strings. People with money, people who don't want questions being asked." Margaret's jaw clenched. "And what about Sarah? Are we just forgetting about her?" Tom sighed. "We're still looking, but if she's out there, she's either hiding or—" He didn't finish the sentence. Margaret's stomach twisted. "You think Kyle did something to her?" Tom didn't answer right away. Then finally, "I think if he didn't, someone else did." A silence settled between them, thick and suffocating. Margaret leaned back in her chair. "What do we do now?" Tom's fingers tapped against the desk. "We fight." Margaret smirked. "You always did like a fight." Tom huffed a quiet laugh. "Not as much as you." Margaret stood. "Then let's make sure they know it." She left before he could say anything else. That night, the first real sign of war came. Margaret was locking up the house when she heard Rusty growl. A second later, something heavy hit the side of the house. She grabbed the shotgun and threw open the door, stepping onto the porch in time to see taillights disappearing into the night. Rusty bolted down the steps, barking furiously. Margaret followed, her breath quick, her pulse hammering. Then she saw it. A spray-painted message across the side of her house. "Walk away." Rusty growled, his body vibrating with anger. Margaret took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She wasn't walking away. Not now, not ever. She turned back toward the house, pulling out her phone. When Tom answered, she didn't waste time. "Tell Kyle if he wants to scare me, he's gonna have to try a hell of a lot harder." She hung up before he could respond. Rusty stood beside her, still staring at the road, still watching the darkness. Margaret scratched his head. "They want to fight, boy." Rusty looked up at her, his tail flicking once. "Then they're about to get one." The night stretched long and uneasy, every shadow outside Margaret's window feeling heavier than usual. She kept the shotgun within reach, but it wasn't the weapon she trusted the most. It was Rusty. He lay by the door, his body still as stone, his ears twitching at every sound. She knew he wasn't sleeping. Neither was she. Lily stirred in her crib, letting out a soft sigh before settling again. Margaret exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over her face. The words painted on her house were still burned into her mind. Walk away. She wasn't going anywhere. The town was shifting, turning against itself. Some people had been dropping by, bringing casseroles and kind words. But there was another side, the ones who had been quiet. The ones who weren't looking her in the eye when she passed them in the grocery store. The ones who were waiting to see what would happen next. And Margaret knew it was only a matter of time before something worse than a message in paint arrived at her door. Kyle Jennings sat in the dim light of his living room, a cigarette burning between his fingers. His other hand clenched a beer bottle, his knuckles white around the neck of it. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Ethan and Sarah Carter had been nothing, a problem to be erased. They had no power, no protection. He had expected the town to look the other way like they always did. But now there was a baby involved, and Margaret Calloway had made herself the damn hero. He sneered at the thought, taking a long drag off his cigarette. She should have kept out of it. Should have done what most people did when trouble came knocking, shut the door and minded their own business. But she hadn't, and that meant he had to deal with her. He flicked his cigarette into the ashtray, then picked up his phone, his fingers moving fast as he dialed a number he hadn't used in a long time. The line clicked after 2 rings. A voice on the other end, low and impatient. "What?" Kyle leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "I need something handled." A pause. "You sure?" Kyle's grip on the bottle tightened. "Yeah." The voice chuckled. "Must be bad if you're calling me." Kyle's teeth clenched. "Just get here." The line went dead. Kyle exhaled, setting the phone down. One way or another, this was ending soon. Margaret was making breakfast when she saw the car. It was unfamiliar, sleek like the one James Bennett had driven, but darker, meaner. It rolled slow down her driveway, and Rusty was on his feet before she had even put the pan down. She wiped her hands on a towel and stepped onto the porch, the shotgun within reach behind the door. The car stopped. The driver's door opened. The man who stepped out wasn't Kyle, but he was cut from the same cloth. His face was hard, his eyes cold, the kind of man who didn't waste time with small talk. Margaret didn't move. "You lost?" The man smirked. "Not at all." Rusty growled low, stepping in front of her. The man glanced at him, then back at Margaret. "That's a good dog you got there." Margaret didn't blink. "State your business." The man chuckled. "Straight to it, huh? All right. I'm here with an offer. You walk away, and this all goes away." Margaret crossed her arms. "I've heard that before." "Then maybe you should listen." His voice stayed even. But there was something behind it, something sharp. Margaret shook her head. "No." The man sighed, rolling his shoulders like he was getting bored. "You know, stubbornness can be real bad for your health." Rusty barked sharply, stepping forward. The man's expression didn't change, but he took a small step back. Margaret smiled without humor. "You threatening me?" The man smirked again. "I'm giving you a choice." Margaret didn't hesitate. "Then here's mine. You get back in that car, and I don't let my dog take your damn hand off." The man held her gaze for a long moment, then exhaled. "All right." He turned. He climbed back into the car and pulled away, slow, deliberate, like he wanted her to watch him leave. Rusty didn't move until the car was out of sight. Margaret exhaled, rubbing his head. Good boy. But she knew this wasn't over. Tom was at her house an hour later. "You sure he didn't give a name?" he asked, pacing the porch. Margaret shook her head. "Didn't need one. He wasn't here to talk." Tom swore under his breath, rubbing his temple. "Kyle's getting desperate." Margaret folded her arms. "Good. Desperate men make mistakes." Tom glanced at her, his jaw tightening. "Don't underestimate him. He's dangerous when he's cornered." Margaret met his gaze. "So am I." Tom exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Damn it, Margaret." She softened slightly. "I'm not being reckless, Tom, but I'm not backing down either." He nodded, running a hand down his face. "Then we need to be ready." Margaret glanced at Rusty, who was still watching the driveway. "We already are." Kyle was on his third drink when the phone rang. He stared at it for a long moment before answering. The voice on the other end was clipped, irritated. "She's not budging." Kyle swallowed, forcing his words out. "Then we push harder." A pause. "You sure you want to go that far?" Kyle clenched his fist around the glass. "I don't have a choice." The voice exhaled. "All right." The line went dead. Kyle sat back, his stomach twisting. This was it, the last move, the one he couldn't take back. Margaret was rocking Lily when Rusty's growl rumbled through the quiet house. She froze, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. Then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, careful. Right outside. Rusty shot up, his body stiff, his growl turning into a snarl. Margaret moved fast, placing Lily in the crib and grabbing the shotgun in one smooth motion. She reached the door just as something heavy slammed against it. Rusty barked, lunging. Margaret pulled the safety off and aimed. She didn't hesitate. Not this time. The blast tore through the door, and there was a shout, followed by the sound of feet scrambling away. Tires screeched against gravel, an engine roared, and then silence. Margaret's breath was ragged, her hands tight around the gun. Rusty stood at the door, still growling, his teeth bared. She stepped closer, peering through the jagged hole the shotgun had left. The yard was empty, but she knew what had happened. They had come for Lily, and they had just learned the hard way that Margaret Calloway wasn't an easy target. She reached down, running a hand over Rusty's back. "We're not done yet, boy." Rusty let out a short huff, his tail flicking once. Margaret tightened her grip on the shotgun. No, they weren't done. Not by a long shot. The echo of the shotgun blast still rang in Margaret's ears long after the night had settled again. She had spent the rest of the dark hours watching the road, waiting, but no one came back. Rusty had stayed close, never once letting his guard down. Even now, as the morning light crept through the trees, he lay by the front door, ears pricked, body still tense. She had expected Tom to show up at dawn, but it was Miss Avery from Child Protective Services who arrived first. The knock at the door wasn't tentative, it was firm. Margaret sighed, running a hand through her hair. She glanced at Lily, still sleeping peacefully in her crib, then crossed the room and opened the door. Miss Avery stood on the porch, her lips pressed in a thin line, her posture stiff as always. "Good morning, Mrs. Calloway," she said. "May I come in?" Margaret stepped aside, motioning her in. Rusty didn't move, but his eyes followed the social worker with careful precision. Miss Avery barely glanced at him before turning her full attention to Margaret. "I need to speak with you about Lily." Margaret folded her arms. "I figured as much." Miss Avery exhaled, shifting her weight. "There's a court hearing scheduled for this afternoon. Kyle Jennings has filed for custody." The words punched through Margaret's chest like ice. She had been expecting trouble, but this was something else entirely. "Custody?" she repeated, her voice sharp. Miss Avery nodded. "He's claiming he's the only rightful guardian left. He's arguing that since Sarah Carter is still missing and Ethan is deceased, he's next in line to care for the child." Margaret felt her pulse hammering. "And the court is actually entertaining this?" Miss Avery hesitated. "It's complicated. Legally, if he can prove a familial connection or any sort of standing, the judge has to consider it." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. "That man has no business raising a child. You know it. I know it. The whole damn town knows it." Miss Avery's face softened, just a fraction. "That's why I came here first. I don't like this any more than you do, but the law doesn't move on feelings. You'll need to be there, ready to fight for her." Margaret exhaled sharply. "I'll be there." Miss Avery nodded, then glanced at Rusty. "And that dog of yours, maybe keep him home." Margaret almost laughed. "Don't worry. If I bring him, Kyle won't show up." Miss Avery didn't argue. She just nodded and left. Margaret turned to Rusty, rubbing his head. "Guess we're going to court." Tom was waiting on the courthouse steps when Margaret arrived. She had dressed as formally as she could manage, a modest navy blue dress. Her hair pulled back, an old brooch pinned at her collar. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was trying to show that she was serious, that she was someone worth listening to. Tom pulled her aside the moment she reached him. "Kyle's got a lawyer," he said under his breath. Margaret frowned. "James Bennett?" "No, someone from out of town. Real polished, real expensive. Someone paid for this." Margaret felt her stomach tighten. "Who?" Tom shook his head. "I don't know yet, but it means this isn't just Kyle stirring things up. Someone wants that baby in his hands." Margaret exhaled slowly. "Then let's make sure they don't get her." They stepped inside together. The courtroom was small, the kind built for civil disputes and minor offenses. There were no jurors, no grand gestures of justice. Just a judge, a few rows of wooden benches, and two sides waiting for a decision. Kyle was already there. He was cleaned up, fresh haircut, a suit that didn't quite fit him right, but he was still Kyle Jennings underneath it all. His smirk, his posture, the way his eyes flicked over Margaret like he had already won. His lawyer sat beside him, a young man with slicked back hair and a briefcase that looked like it cost more than Margaret's truck. Margaret sat on the opposite side, her jaw tight, her hands resting in her lap. Miss Avery was there, sitting beside the county attorney, a man she barely knew, but was counting on to fight for Lily like she would. The judge entered. Everyone rose. The proceedings began. Kyle's lawyer was smooth, practiced. He spoke about stability, about family, about how Kyle was the only remaining link to Lily's parents. He painted a picture of a man who had made mistakes but was ready to change, ready to step up. Margaret wanted to scream. Then it was her turn. She stood, her back straight, her voice clear. She spoke about Lily, about how she had been abandoned in a storm, about how Rusty had saved her life. She told them about Kyle's threats, about the messages left on her house, about how no child would ever be safe under his roof. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. When she finished, the judge was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to Kyle. "Mr. Jennings, you claim to be a suitable guardian, yet you have a criminal record with multiple offenses, including DUI and assault. You have no stable employment, no permanent residence, and you are currently under investigation for involvement in a hit-and-run accident." Kyle's smirk faltered. The judge continued. "Additionally, you have failed to provide any proof of a familial connection to Lily Carter. Your claim is based solely on the assertion that her parents were acquaintances of yours." Kyle's lawyer shifted. "Your Honor, my client," the judge held up a hand. "Your client has provided no evidence that he is fit to care for a child. Furthermore, there is credible testimony that he has made threats against the current caretaker." Margaret held her breath. The judge turned to her. "Mrs. Calloway, you are not a blood relative, but you have provided shelter, care, and stability for this child since she was found. The court recognizes the importance of continuity in a child's life. Margaret's fingers dug into the fabric of her dress. The judge straightened. Therefore, I am granting temporary guardianship to Mrs. Calloway while further investigation into Lily Carter's biological family is conducted. Mr. Jennings, your petition for custody is denied. Margaret felt something release in her chest. Kyle stood, his face red. This is bullshit. The judge's gavel slammed down. Mr. Jennings, if you have an outburst in my courtroom again, you will be held in contempt. Kyle's lawyer muttered something to him, but Kyle wasn't listening. He was staring at Margaret, his eyes burning with something dark, something dangerous. Margaret met his gaze and didn't flinch. The judge adjourned the hearing. People shuffled out. Tom placed a firm hand on Margaret's shoulder. You won today. Margaret nodded, but she wasn't smiling. Kyle hadn't walked away in defeat. He had walked away planning his next move. And Margaret knew this fight wasn't over. Not yet. Margaret walked out of the courthouse with her chin high, but she could feel Kyle's eyes burning into her back. She didn't look at him. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Tom stayed close beside her, his hand hovering near his belt like he was waiting for Kyle to make a move. Rusty was in the truck, watching through the window. His golden eyes locked onto the courthouse doors, like he knew exactly who they were dealing with. Margaret reached the truck, opened the door, and climbed in without a word. Rusty gave a low, approving huff as she settled into her seat. Tom leaned into the window. You did good in there. Margaret let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It's not over. No, Tom admitted. It's not. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression darkening. But you rattled him. Margaret gripped the wheel. Rattled men are dangerous, Tom. Tom nodded. That's why I'll be keeping extra eyes on your place. If Kyle tries anything, we'll be ready. Margaret appreciated the gesture, but she knew the law had its limits. Men like Kyle didn't always wait for an opportunity. Sometimes they made their own. She started the truck. I should get back. Lily needs to eat soon. Tom stepped back and gave Rusty one last look. Keep an eye on her, boy. Rusty let out a short bark. Margaret pulled out of the lot, her hands steady on the wheel, but her mind was racing. The fight wasn't over, and she wasn't the only one who knew it. Kyle sat in the back booth of Benny's diner, his fingers drumming against the table. His lawyer had left him in a rush, eager to put distance between himself and a lost case, but Kyle wasn't done yet. James Bennett slid into the booth across from him, adjusting his cuffs. You're lucky I don't bill by the hour. Kyle's jaw clenched. I'm not in the mood for your bullshit, James. James smirked. That's what you get when you lose. Kyle grabbed the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. I'm not losing. James raised an eyebrow. You sure? Because from where I'm sitting, Margaret Calloway just made you look like an idiot. Kyle's face darkened. She won today, but I'm not finished. James exhaled, shaking his head. Kyle, you don't get it. The judge just handed her temporary guardianship. The only way you're getting that kid now is if something big happens. Kyle leaned in, lowering his voice. Then maybe something big needs to happen. James sat back, staring at him for a long moment. You're talking dangerous now. Kyle smirked. I was always dangerous. James shook his head. Look, I can push things in court. Drag it out. Make Margaret's life hell with legal fees. But if you're thinking about handling this some other way, he trailed off, rubbing his temple. You better think long and hard before you do something stupid. Kyle grinned. I don't think I do. James sighed. And that's why you're always in trouble. Kyle leaned back, stretching his arms. You let me worry about that. James stood, tossing a few bills onto the table. I hope you know what you're doing. Kyle chuckled, watching him walk away. He knew exactly what he was doing. Margaret rocked Lily gently, humming an old tune under her breath. The baby was warm against her chest, her tiny fingers curling into the fabric of Margaret's shirt. Rusty lay at her feet, his ears twitching at every little noise. Margaret had spent years alone in this house, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of life, full of purpose, and full of danger. She had won in court, but she hadn't won the war. Kyle wasn't the type to take no for an answer. He would come back. She knew it. She just didn't know when. The phone rang, jarring her from her thoughts. She picked it up. Hello? There was a pause, then a familiar voice. Mrs. Calloway? Margaret straightened. Yes? This is Miss Avery. We need to talk. Margaret's stomach dropped. What's wrong? Miss Avery hesitated. There's been a development. It's about the case. Margaret's grip tightened on the phone. I'll be right there. The CPS office was small, tucked into the second floor of the county building. Margaret had always hated places like this, places where decisions were made about people's lives by people who barely knew them. Miss Avery sat behind her desk, her expression unreadable. I wanted to tell you this in person. Margaret sat down slowly. Tell me what? Miss Avery folded her hands. Kyle filed an appeal. Margaret exhaled sharply. Of course he did. Miss Avery didn't react. And that's not all. He's also filed an emergency motion for custody. Margaret's pulse spiked. On what grounds? Miss Avery shifted. On the grounds that you're unfit. Margaret's breath caught. What? Miss Avery sighed. He's claiming you're too old to care for an infant, that you live alone, that you have no formal experience with children. He's also... She hesitated. Margaret's heart pounded. He's also what? Miss Avery's gaze was pained. He's arguing that you're a danger, that your association with a known aggressive dog puts the child at risk. Margaret shot up from her chair. That's bullshit. Miss Avery looked exhausted. I know, but Kyle's lawyer found a way to make it stick. There's going to be a review board. They're sending someone to evaluate you. Margaret swallowed hard. When? Miss Avery's lips pressed into a thin line. Tomorrow. Margaret sat back down, her hands shaking. Kyle was coming at her from every angle, and this time he had the law on his side. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, Lily curled against her chest, Rusty stretched out beside her. She ran her fingers through his fur, feeling the tension in his body, the way he never fully relaxed anymore. I need you to be good tomorrow, she whispered. Rusty's ears flicked. They're looking for an excuse to take her, she continued. We can't give them one. Rusty didn't move for a long moment. Then he lifted his head and nudged her hand. Margaret smiled weakly. That's a good boy. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the walls. Kyle was playing the long game. But Margaret wasn't done fighting. She held Lily tighter, pressing a soft kiss to the baby's forehead. No one's taking you, she whispered. Rusty let out a low, steady breath, and Margaret felt something settle deep in her chest. They weren't just waiting for Kyle's next move, they were preparing for it. The morning was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that carried weight, like the air just before a storm breaks. Margaret woke early, not because she had slept well, but because sleep never truly came. Lily had fussed through the night, picking up on the tension in the house, even though she was too young to understand it. And Rusty had barely rested at all. He had stayed near the door, his ears twitching at every distant sound, waiting. Now, as Margaret sipped her coffee on the porch, watching the mist roll over the fields, she was waiting too. The CPS evaluator would be there soon. A stranger in a suit, clipboard in hand, ready to decide whether she was fit to raise a child, ready to listen to whatever Kyle and his lawyer had put in their ears. She knew what they wanted to hear, that she was too old, that she lived alone, that she couldn't possibly take care of a baby, that Rusty was dangerous. She took another sip, her grip tightening around the mug. The sound of tires crunching on gravel made her lift her head. A black sedan pulled into the driveway, the kind of car that never belonged in small towns. Rusty stood, his muscles tensing, but he didn't growl. He just watched, waiting. The door opened and a woman stepped out. Late 40s, maybe early 50s, her short-cropped hair neat, her blazer too stiff for the humid air. She carried a leather folder, thick with papers, the weight of bureaucracy in her hands. Margaret set her coffee down, rising slowly. "You must be the evaluator." The woman smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "Mrs. Calloway, I presume?" Margaret nodded. "That's right." The woman extended a hand. "I'm Emily Barnes, Child Protective Services. May I come in?" Margaret didn't shake her hand. Instead, she stepped aside, holding the door open. "Go on, then." Emily stepped inside, glancing around as if she could assess an entire home's worth in a single look. Margaret had cleaned, not for appearances, but because it was who she was. The house was warm, well kept. It smelled like coffee and something faintly floral. Nothing about it screamed unfit. Emily's eyes landed on Rusty, who sat by the fireplace, his golden eyes locked on her. "He's big," she noted. Margaret arched a brow. "That a problem?" Emily flipped through her folder. "There was an incident, a report that you fired a gun outside your home, that this dog was aggressive." Margaret exhaled through her nose. "If someone tries to break into my house, I'm going to defend it. That's got nothing to do with how I raise a child." Emily didn't argue. She just made a note. "I'll need to see Lily now." Margaret nodded, stepping into the nursery. Lily was awake, cooing softly to herself, her tiny fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. Margaret scooped her up, holding her close as she turned back to Emily. "She's happy," Margaret said simply. Emily studied the baby for a moment, then wrote something else down. "And if something happens to you?" Margaret's spine stiffened. "What?" Emily looked at her, expression unreadable. "You're 72, Mrs. Calloway. If something were to happen to you, who would care for Lily?" Margaret knew this was coming, knew it was the argument Kyle's lawyer had probably whispered into the evaluator's ear. She had prepared for it. "I have a legal document on file," she said. "If anything happens to me, custody will go to Sheriff Tom Reynolds." Emily blinked, momentarily surprised. Margaret smirked. "Didn't expect that, did you?" Emily made another note. "I'll have to confirm that." Margaret shrugged. "Go ahead." The rest of the evaluation passed in clipped conversation, observations noted, quiet judgments made. By the time Emily closed her folder, the air in the room felt thinner. She stood. "We'll be in touch." Margaret followed her to the door. "You do that." Emily hesitated for half a second before stepping out, sliding into her car and disappearing down the driveway. Margaret watched until the dust settled. Then she turned to Rusty. "Well?" Rusty thumped his tail against the floor. Margaret sighed. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Tom was at the diner when she got to town. She walked through the door, and the murmurs started. She ignored them. Tom was in his usual booth, his coffee untouched, his jaw tight. He looked up as she slid into the seat across from him. "Well?" he asked. Margaret exhaled. "They're going to try to take her." Tom's fingers drummed against the table. "We won't let them." Margaret leaned forward. "Kyle's not going to wait for the courts to do it, Tom. He's going to come for her himself." Tom nodded once. "I know." Margaret's gaze swept over the diner. People were watching, some with sympathy, others with unease. The town was splitting down the middle. There were those who wanted justice for Ethan and Sarah, who wanted Lily to be safe, and then there were the ones who just wanted to avoid trouble. Margaret's voice lowered. "We have to be ready." Tom sighed, rubbing his temple. "It's already started." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" Tom's jaw tightened. "Deputy Wilson found someone slashing tires behind the hardware store last night. She caught them before they finished, but they ran." Margaret's stomach dropped. "Kyle's people?" Tom nodded. "They're testing us, seeing how far they can push before we push back." Margaret clenched her fists. "Then maybe it's time we push first." Tom studied her for a long moment. "What are you thinking?" Margaret smirked. "I think this town needs to remember what it means to stand up." By the time the sun set, the diner was full. People had come, shop owners, ranchers, old friends. Not everyone, but enough. Margaret stood at the front, Rusty at her side, Tom beside her. She looked out over the faces, some familiar, some hesitant. Then she spoke. "We all know why we're here," she said. "We all know what's happening." The room was silent. Margaret's voice didn't waver. "They're trying to scare us, trying to make us think we can't do anything, that we just have to let it happen." She paused. "I say to hell with that." A murmur spread through the crowd. Margaret took a step forward. "This isn't just about me or Lily. It's about all of us. It's about what kind of town we want to be. Do we let men like Kyle Jennings decide that for us?" The murmurs grew louder. Margaret raised her chin. "Because I won't. And I don't think any of you will either." A man in the back, Bill Tanner, owner of the auto shop, stood. "What do you need us to do?" Margaret's chest tightened. Tom stepped forward. "We organize. We watch each other's backs. If Kyle and his people want to play games, they'll learn real fast that we don't scare easy." Bill nodded. "Damn right we don't." One by one, others nodded, stood, voices rising. Margaret felt something shift. Kyle had started a fight, but he had no idea what kind of town he was fighting. The town had made its choice. Margaret saw it in the set of their shoulders, in the way they spoke to each other, in the way they looked at her, not with pity but with resolve. She wasn't alone anymore. The meeting at the diner had stretched into the late hours, men and women forming plans, deciding who would watch over which part of town, who would make sure Kyle and his people knew they weren't going to roll over. It wasn't just about her or Lily, or even the threats Kyle had been making. It was about the town itself, but resolve didn't mean safety. Margaret knew Kyle wouldn't let this go. She felt it in her bones. By the time she got home, exhaustion sat heavy in her limbs, but she knew there would be no rest tonight. Rusty jumped out of the truck before she had even put it in park. His head lifting, ears pricked. He was always watching now, waiting for the thing they both knew was coming. Margaret carried Lily inside, locking the door behind her, double-checking the bolts. Rusty didn't follow her in right away. He did his usual rounds, sniffing the perimeter, making sure nothing was out of place. He had been doing this every night, only this time he didn't come back right away. Margaret felt the absence immediately. Rusty never lingered outside longer than a minute or two. She set Lily in her crib and went back to the door, peering through the window. Rusty stood at the edge of the yard, his posture stiff, his head low. Margaret opened the door. "Rusty?" He didn't turn. That's when she saw the movement in the trees. It was just a flicker at first, barely visible in the dim light from the porch. But then a figure stepped forward. Kyle. Margaret's grip on the door tightened. Rusty let out a low growl, his body vibrating with tension. Kyle lifted his hands, palms out. "Easy now." His voice was too smooth, too casual. Margaret's heart pounded. "What the hell do you want?" Kyle smirked. "We both know the answer to that." Margaret glanced toward the truck. She had her shotgun inside, but it was too far to reach without turning her back. Rusty took a step forward, his growl deepening. Kyle's smirk faltered slightly. "Damn dog." Margaret forced her voice to stay even. "Get off my property, Kyle." He shook his head. "See? That's not going to work for me. You're making things real difficult." Margaret clenched her jaw. "Not my problem." Kyle took another step forward, and Rusty lunged. It happened so fast, Margaret barely had time to react. Rusty launched himself at Kyle, his teeth flashing in the dim light. Kyle barely had time to raise his arm before Rusty's jaws clamped down. A strangled yell ripped from Kyle's throat as he staggered back, struggling to shake the dog off. Margaret ran. She reached the truck in seconds, yanking the door open and grabbing the shotgun from the rack. When she turned back, Rusty was still locked onto Kyle's arm, his growls turning into vicious snarls. Kyle's other hand fumbled at his waist, reaching for something. A knife, Margaret didn't think. She raised the shotgun and fired. The shot rang through the night, shattering the stillness. Kyle screamed, the knife clattering to the ground as he stumbled back, blood dripping from his arm where Rusty had torn into him. Rusty released his grip, falling back onto his haunches, his teeth bared. His chest heaved with the effort, his eyes never leaving Kyle. Margaret took a step forward, aiming the shotgun squarely at Kyle's chest. "You have 10 seconds to get the hell off my land," she said, her voice like steel. Kyle's face twisted in fury, but he wasn't stupid enough to test her. He clutched his bleeding arm, backing away slowly. "This ain't over, Calloway." Margaret cocked the shotgun. 9. Kyle spat at the ground, then turned and disappeared into the trees. Rusty didn't move until the last trace of him was gone. Margaret lowered the gun, exhaling shakily. She turned to Rusty. His chest was still heaving, his body tense. He was hurt. She could see it now. A thin line of red stained his side, where Kyle had managed to slice him before she had fired. "Damn it!" she whispered, kneeling beside him. Rusty whined softly, licking his wound. Margaret ran a hand over his head. "Let's get you inside, boy." Tom showed up 20 minutes later. Margaret hadn't called him, but she should have known he would come. News traveled fast, especially in a town that was already on edge. He barely glanced at the blood on the porch before turning to her. "What happened?" Margaret crossed her arms. "Kyle happened." Tom swore under his breath. "Is he dead?" "No." Tom exhaled, scrubbing a hand over his face. "Damn!" Margaret arched a brow. "Disappointed." Tom shook his head. "Would have been simpler." Margaret didn't argue. Tom turned his attention to Rusty, who was lying on the rug, his breathing slow but steady. "He saved you again, didn't he?" Margaret nodded. "If he hadn't been here—" She didn't finish the sentence. Tom crouched beside Rusty, scratching his ears. "You're a hell of a dog, boy." Rusty let out a tired huff, his tail thumping weakly against the floor. Tom stood, his expression hardening. "Kyle won't stop now. He's too far in." Margaret nodded. "I know." Tom sighed. "I'll station a deputy outside." "But Margaret, we both know this is going to end one way or another." Margaret met his gaze. "Then let's make sure it ends in our favor." Tom held her stare for a moment, then nodded. "I'll be back in the morning," he said, heading for the door. Margaret locked it behind him. She turned back to Rusty, crouching beside him. "You scared me, you know that?" Rusty licked her hand. She smiled faintly. "You're a damn good dog." Rusty closed his eyes, his body finally relaxing. Margaret sat beside him, resting a hand on his back. Kyle had drawn blood tonight, but he hadn't won, and he never would. Morning came slow, dragging itself through the sky, as if it was reluctant to bring the new day. Margaret hadn't slept. She had spent the night on the floor beside Rusty, one hand resting gently on his back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath. The wound on his side wasn't deep, but it had been enough to shake her, enough to remind her how close she had come to losing him. Lily had slept soundly, unaware of the violence that had nearly taken everything from her. Margaret envied that innocence. Now, as the first light crept through the window, Margaret rose stiffly, every joint in her body protesting. Rusty's eyes flicked open at her movement, his ears twitching, but he didn't lift his head. "You're still tired," she murmured, scratching behind his ears. "You did good, boy." A knock at the door made her pulse jump. She glanced at the clock. Too early for a casual visit, too late for bad news that couldn't wait. She moved carefully, shotgun within reach, and cracked the door open. Tom stood on the porch, his hat pulled low, his face lined with something that wasn't quite exhaustion but carried the same weight. Margaret stepped aside without a word. He entered, shutting the door behind him. His eyes flicked to Rusty, lingering for a moment before he turned back to her. "They arrested Kyle an hour ago," he said. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, but it was too soon to call it relief. Tom sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "They found him passed out in his truck, still bleeding. He was drunk off his ass." Margaret folded her arms. "He'll find a way out of it." Tom met her gaze. "Not this time." She waited. Tom exhaled. "We got enough on him now to press charges, breaking and entering, assault, violation of the protective order, and with the attempted abduction of Lily on record, he's facing real time." Margaret stared at him. "How much time?" Tom's jaw tightened. "That depends on the judge." Margaret's breath came slow, steady. "And the judge?" Tom hesitated. "We're about to find out." The courthouse was packed. Word had spread fast, and now half the town had shown up to see what would happen to Kyle Jennings. Some were there for justice. Others, Margaret suspected, just wanted to see what kind of man would come after a baby and lose. Kyle sat at the defendant's table, his arm bandaged, his face set in an expression of forced indifference. He looked like a man who had convinced himself that this was all temporary, that he would walk out of here the same way he had always walked out of trouble. His lawyer, a man Margaret didn't recognize, leaned in, whispering something to him. Kyle's smirk flickered. Margaret sat on the other side of the room, Lily in her lap, Tom beside her. Rusty wasn't here, but she wished he was. He had earned the right to see this through. The judge entered. The room rose. Margaret kept her eyes on Kyle. He didn't look at her. The proceedings began. The state laid out its case, breaking into her home, brandishing a weapon, the threats, the history. They painted a picture of a man who had lost control, who had crossed the line from small-town criminal to something much worse. Kyle's lawyer argued back, spinning the usual web. He was drunk. He made a mistake. He had no intention of harming anyone. Margaret almost laughed at that. Then the judge spoke. "I've reviewed the evidence presented," he said, his voice steady, firm, "and I've considered the defendant's history, as well as the serious nature of the charges before us." The room was so quiet that Margaret could hear the faint ticking of the courtroom clock. The judge's gaze settled on Kyle. "It is the decision of this court that Kyle Jennings will serve a prison sentence of 10 years. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Kyle's smirk vanished. Margaret let out a slow breath. The judge wasn't finished. "In addition," he continued, "any future petitions for custody or visitation rights regarding Lily Carter are permanently revoked. This court finds the defendant unfit for guardianship." This time, the murmurs turned into full-fledged whispers. Margaret's hands trembled. Kyle shot to his feet. "You can't do that!" His lawyer yanked him down, hissing something in his ear. The judge's gavel slammed down. "You are dismissed." The crowd began to move. Voices rising, people turning to each other, opinions forming like a storm in real time. Margaret didn't move. Tom touched her arm. "You all right?" She exhaled. "I don't know," he nodded. "That's fair." Kyle was being led away in cuffs, his face red with fury, his body tense like a man about to explode. He turned once, locking eyes with Margaret, and for the first time she saw it. Fear. Then he was gone. The house was quiet when they returned. Margaret carried Lily inside, setting her gently in the crib. She brushed her fingers over the baby's cheek, watching as she slept peacefully, oblivious to the battle that had just been won. Rusty lay in his usual spot by the door, his eyes half open. He wagged his tail once when he saw her. She knelt beside him, running a hand through his fur. "You did it," she murmured. Rusty huffed softly. She hadn't expected to win. Not like this. Not so decisively, but Kyle was gone, and Lily was safe. And Lily. For the first time in what felt like forever, Margaret let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be okay. She leaned down, pressing a kiss to Rusty's head. "Thank you." Rusty sighed, pressing his nose into her hand. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything settle into something lighter. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready for it. Margaret had lived through her share of storms, but none had ever left a mark quite like this one. The town had changed. It wasn't just the way people looked at her now, with quiet respect, with knowing nods, with the weight of understanding in their eyes. It was something deeper, something that stretched beyond her and Rusty and Lily. Kyle Jennings was gone. It had taken years, but the town had finally pushed back against the kind of trouble that had lingered in the shadows for too long. Now came the hard part, picking up the pieces. Margaret rocked Lily slowly on the porch, watching the road, watching the town move through its day like everything hadn't changed, but it had, and she wasn't sure she was ready for what came next. Rusty lay stretched out beside her, his body relaxed, but his eyes still watchful. He had healed well over the past few days, the wound on his side no longer fresh, though the scar would remain. Just another mark on a body that had seen too much. Margaret exhaled, rubbing his head. "We're still here, boy." Rusty huffed softly, his tail flicking once. The sound of a car approaching made him lift his head. Margaret recognized the cruiser before it even pulled into the driveway. Tom climbed out, taking his time, like he wasn't in a rush to say whatever he had come to say. Margaret waited, letting him have his moment. He finally sighed, stepping onto the porch. "How's she doing?" Margaret looked down at Lily. Her tiny fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. "She doesn't know anything's different," Tom nodded. "Probably for the best." Silence stretched between them, comfortable in a way it hadn't been before. Tom shifted. "Judge signed the final paperwork this morning." Margaret's stomach clenched. "And?" Tom pulled a folder from under his arm, setting it down on the porch railing. "And it's done. You're her legal guardian now." Margaret swallowed hard. She had fought so hard for this, for Lily, and now it was real. She ran a trembling hand over the folder, as if touching it would somehow make it settle in her chest. "Just like that?" Tom chuckled. "Nothing about this was just like that, Margaret." She let out a breath, shaking her head. "No, I suppose not." Tom sat on the porch railing, looking out at the fields beyond. "You sure you're ready for this?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "I was ready the moment that dog put her on my porch." Rusty wagged his tail slightly, as if he understood every word. Tom smirked. "That dog's got a hell of a story now." Margaret nodded. "And he's earned every bit of it." Tom's face turned serious again. "You should know, Kyle's lawyer isn't happy about the ruling. He tried to file an appeal." Margaret stiffened. "And?" Tom sighed. "Tom, Judge shut it down before it could start. Kyle's got no claim here, not anymore." Margaret relaxed, just a fraction, but Tom wasn't finished. "He's got a long stretch in prison ahead of him, but he's still got friends, people who don't like how this turned out." Margaret met his gaze. "And you think they'll come looking?" Tom didn't answer right away. Then he sighed. "I think men like Kyle don't like losing." Margaret exhaled through her nose. "Let them come." Tom smiled faintly. "I figured you'd say that." They sat in silence for a long moment, watching the road, watching the town move through its day. Margaret finally spoke. "What now?" Tom tilted his hat back. "Now you get to live your life." Margaret smirked. "Not sure I remember how to do that." Tom chuckled. "Guess you'll have to learn." Margaret looked down at Lily, at the baby who had been carried through a storm and delivered to her by a dog who had known what to do when no one else did. She ran a hand over Rusty's head. "We'll figure it out," she murmured. Rusty let out a slow, content sigh. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret believed it. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly, things began to settle. The town had moved past the worst of it, though the echoes of what had happened still lingered in whispers and glances. Some people still avoided Margaret in town, as if her presence alone reminded them of the fight they hadn't wanted to be part of. Others went out of their way to stop by her house, offering food, checking in, making sure she knew she wasn't alone. She appreciated those people. Rusty had become a fixture of the town in a way she never expected. People knew his story now, knew what he had done. Some stopped to pet him when she brought him into town, others just nodded in respect. Even the kids at the school had started calling him the hero dog. Margaret had never been one for attention, but she didn't mind it for Rusty. He deserved it. Lily had grown stronger, her tiny hands reaching for everything, her giggles filling the house in ways Margaret hadn't known she needed. There were hard days, long nights, moments when doubt crept in, but every time she felt it pressing down, she'd look at Lily, at Rusty, and remember, this was where they were meant to be. Then one afternoon, a letter arrived. Margaret frowned when she saw it, the envelope thick, the return address unfamiliar. She opened it carefully, scanning the first few lines, and her breath caught in her throat. It was from Sarah Carter's sister, a sister Margaret hadn't known existed. She read the letter twice, her hands steady, despite the storm of emotions churning in her chest. Sarah's sister had been out of the country when everything had happened. She had only just learned of her brother-in-law's death, of her sister's disappearance, and she wanted to meet Lily. Margaret set the letter down, exhaling slowly. She had fought so hard for this child, had built a home around her, and now she might have to let go. Rusty nudged her hand, sensing the shift in her mood. She looked down at him, her fingers running absently through his fur. "What do we do now, boy?" she whispered. Rusty just pressed closer, as if telling her that whatever came next, they'd face it together. Margaret didn't sleep much that night. The letter sat on her kitchen table, untouched since she'd first read it, but the words rattled in her mind like loose nails. Sarah's sister wanted to meet Lily. Margaret wasn't sure how to feel about that. She had spent the past few months fighting for Lily, protecting her, loving her like her own. And now, just as things were beginning to settle, someone from the past had stepped forward. Someone with a claim that Margaret couldn't ignore. The next morning she called Tom. He arrived within the hour, sipping coffee from a thermos, his eyes scanning the letter when she handed it to him. He read in silence, his expression unreadable, then set it down carefully. "Well," he finally said, "this complicates things." Margaret exhaled. "That's one way to put it." Tom leaned back in his chair. "Legally, she has a right to see Lily, but it doesn't mean she's taking her away." Margaret stared at the letter. But what if she wants to?" Tom sighed. "Then we cross that bridge when we get there." Margaret swallowed, nodding slowly. "She's coming next week." Tom studied her. "How do you feel about that?" Margaret glanced toward the living room, where Lily sat on a blanket, chewing absently on a stuffed rabbit, while Rusty lay beside her, his watchful eyes never leaving the baby. She forced a steady breath. "I don't know." Tom nodded. "Then we take it one step at a time." Margaret wished it were that simple, but deep down she knew this wasn't just about Lily anymore. This was about what family truly meant. The day Sarah's sister arrived, the air felt heavier than usual. Margaret had spent the morning cleaning, not because she needed to impress anyone, but because she needed something to do with her hands. Rusty sensed her unease. He followed her from room to room, his steady presence grounding her in a way nothing else could. When the knock finally came, Margaret hesitated for only a moment before opening the door. The woman standing on the porch had Sarah's eyes, soft, kind, but carrying the weight of loss. She was younger than Margaret had expected, maybe mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back into a simple braid. "Mrs. Calloway?" she asked gently. Margaret nodded. "You must be Claire." Claire smiled, though it wavered at the edges. "Yes, thank you for seeing me." Margaret stepped aside, letting her in. Rusty stayed close, his eyes never leaving the visitor, but he didn't growl. He seemed to understand this was different. Claire's gaze immediately found Lily, who was sitting on the floor stacking blocks, blissfully unaware of the storm swirling around her future. "She looks just like Sarah did at that age," Claire whispered. Margaret's throat tightened. "She's a good baby." Claire turned to her. "I know this must be hard for you. I don't want to take her away from the only home she's known." Margaret studied her, searching for deception but found none. Claire swallowed. "I just want to be in her life." Margaret exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "Then we start there," she said. Claire smiled, relief washing over her face. Rusty thumped his tail against the floor, as if approving the decision. Lily giggled, clapping her tiny hands. Margaret looked around at the life they had built, at the love that had filled the cracks left by tragedy, and knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Because family wasn't just about blood. It was about who stayed, who fought, who loved. And in that, Lily would always be home.